What's going on, everybody? This is Owen from Owen's Rock and Metal Podcast. Welcome to episode number 7. Thank you all for tuning in so much. If you haven't, be sure to go back and check out previous episodes. Last week, my buddy Roman and I, we sat down and we talked about Metallica's Master of Puppets. It recently celebrated its 35th anniversary, so be sure to check that out if you're a Metallica fan or a metal fan at all. But today, episode 7, I thought it'd be fun to talk about bands from the 70s. So we're talking about 70s artists, primarily in the vein of rock and the roots of metal really being discovered in the 70s. So, if you've got suggestions for artists who you want to hear talked about or albums you want to hear talked about, you can always let me know. You can message me on my Instagram here, Owen's Rock and Metal Podcast on Instagram. You can let me know future episode suggestions you'd like to see in the future. I'm always open to new suggestions. And I, one more time, want to thank you all for tuning in, all of you listeners here today. So today we are talking about bands from the 70s, episode 7, 70s. That's the connection there. So, what I'm considering a band from the 70s today is a band who debuted in the 70s, whose first album came out in the 1970s. Somewhere in that era. It could be 1979, it could be 1970. As long as that album debuted in the 70s, then I'm considering them part of the original mentions. But, of course, other bands dominated the 70s as well. So you know what? I'm just going to talk about some bands from the 70s that I like. Starting off kind of broad here, the 70s was kind of a happening time for music, particularly rock and metal. We have, coming out of the 1960s, which was a very transformative decade for rock music, we had the British invasion of the 60s, beginning in 1964, and lots of groups came out of that, but of course, none more important and none more impactful than the Beatles. The Beatles, of course, as some of you may know, break up in 1970. So coming into the decade that is the 70s, we have the breakup of one of the biggest groups of all time. So that definitely rocks the music scene. The Beatles' last album, Let It Be, produced by Phil Spector, released in 1970, featuring tracks like Across the Universe and Let It Be. That's the Beatles are done. They're done as the Beatles. Obviously, they go off and make solo careers. John Lennon and Paul McCartney and, George Harrison and Ringo Starr all go off and do their own thing. And John Lennon has Imagine. Paul McCartney goes off and does The Wings. And that's all good and well. So we get into the 70s. Biggest band in the world breaks up. So there's room for a new sound, a new band to kind of come on the scene. But it doesn't really happen like how it happened in 1964 when the Beatles came on the Ed Sullivan Show. The genres towards the end of the 70s, towards the end of the 60s, are kind of fragmenting. They're splitting off. And that's kind of a big theme of the 70s and decades beyond. Fragmentation of rock music. Rock music begins 1960s and even into the 50s. It has, obviously blues, some jazz roots there, but very heavy blues influence, very R&B influenced music in the 50s. And the 60s, we see, a lot of copycat artists, some would call them. And then it kind of shifts in other, genres of rock music. Things such as surf rock with the Beach Boys in the 60s. Garage rock with bands like The Who. Psychedelic music and avant-garde stuff with bands like Pink Floyd. All that starts to come on the scene. And one fragmentation of rock is metal, which is one of the primary topics that we talk about on this podcast. So 1970s, we talk about a band who really, I will say founded metal. I will go that far. Black Sabbath. And be sure, if you're a fan of Black Sabbath and you haven't already, go back and listen to episode number 4 of the podcast where we talked about, my friend John and I, we talked about Black Sabbath's debut from 1970. So, starting off the decade with Black Sabbath. I'm a big Black Sabbath fan. Now, if we consider Black Sabbath of the 70s, that's Black Sabbath from 1970, and their last album from the 70s was Never Say Die, which we will talk about later on down the line on this podcast. We'll probably have a whole episode dedicated to each one of these Sabbath albums because I think Sabbath is that influential and that noteworthy. But of course, from Sabbath from 1970 to I believe it's 78 or 79, that's the Ozzy years. That's Ozzy Osbourne Sabbath. That's the Sabbath that you hear on the radio. That's the Sabbath that everyone recognizes. It's songs like Iron Man. It's songs like War Pigs. It's songs like Paranoid. Those are the songs that are really Sabbath's big legacy. So 70 Sabbath for me is the best Sabbath. That being said, Sabbath continues after the 70s into the 80s with Ronnie James Dio releasing 2 albums with the band, and then several other singers along the line. Glenn Hughes, the guy from Deep Purple, which Deep Purple, another 70s band I might talk about later on in the show. I don't know why I want to say Ian Gillian, Sabbath, Born Again in the mid-80s, and then in the late 90s, Ozzy comes back, and there's tons of Sabbath beyond the 70s, but 70s Sabbath is the prime Sabbath. It's the best Sabbath in my opinion, and it's the most recognizable stuff. So there's 8 albums from 1970 to 1978 that Sabbath releases in this period. As I touched on in episode 4, and I'll touch on again, kind of the roots of metal here with Black Sabbath's debut, and then second album Paranoid, one of the best albums of all time, I would say, in my opinion, and we will definitely have to do an episode on that now that I'm just thinking out loud here. And then Masters of Reality, which is a really heavy album and gets lots of recognition for being a great metal album. And then we have Volume 4 from Black Sabbath, which, another great metal album. And then we have one of my personal favorite Sabbath albums, Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, with their 5th album. I like it's still heavy, but they kind of switch things up, slightly more, I don't even know what to call it. Almost like synth sounds, almost kind of like funkier, kind of poppier music. And then after we have Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, there is, I'm blanking here. Sabotage. After Sabotage, Technical Ecstasy. And then after Technical Ecstasy, it's Never Say Die. So that's Sabbath from the 70s. Very good albums, very good songs, very influential music. The same 4 core members throughout the 70s, Ozzy Osbourne, Tony Iommi, Bill Ward, and the great Geezer Butler. So that's one of my favorite bands from the 70s. So if we look at other bands that come from the 70s, this next band kind of, I'm not going to say piggybacks, but they get their start from Black Sabbath. And they pick up right where Sabbath leaves off. So I'm talking about Van Halen. Now, Van Halen, their real prime time comes in the 80s, I would say, but their roots are in the 70s. 1978 is when their first album comes out. The original lineup for Van Halen, David Lee Roth, Eddie Van Halen, Michael Anthony, and Alex Van Halen behind the drums. They toured as an opening act for Sabbath, and I believe it got to the point, Sabbath, definitely still talented, but wasn't as fresh and as new as they were at the beginning of the decade. So towards the end of the 70s, when Sabbath was playing, Van Halen had a different energy, a new energy, a fresh energy that people just wanted to see more of compared to what Sabbath was delivering. And, they kind of outshined. I'm not sure how you would say that, but I'm not going to worry about it too much. They kind of outshined Sabbath, and with good reason. I mean, David Lee Roth, I think, is one of the greatest frontmen of all time. I just listened to his podcast where he was on Joe Rogan. It's a lot of fun. If you're a David Lee Roth or a Van Halen fan at all, or even someone who just likes to listen to a good podcast, there's a podcast recommendation for you, Joe Rogan's episode with David Lee Roth. I think it's very good. Eddie Van Halen, as a guitar player, he is one of the greatest guitar players of all time. I would say top 5 for sure. Maybe we'll have an episode where we rank guitarists, or maybe we'll have an episode where we talk about the legacy of EVH and his impact. And of course, he passed away in October of 2020. So rest in peace to Eddie Van Halen. But yeah, and Van Halen is one of the most explosive acts of all time. They're just the soundtrack, of a generation. They are incredibly influential when we talk about their influence and their impact. I mean, you still hear their songs on the radio played to this day. But if we're talking specifically about the 1970s, we're talking really 2 albums that come out in the 70s. Their first album debuts in 1978, and let me tell you, it is my favorite Van Halen album. It starts off with Eruption, and if you haven't heard Eruption, it's fantastic. It's as a guitar player, it's awe-inspiring. It's like, what is he doing? Like, Eddie is just going insane on the guitar. We've got Running with the Devil, classic Van Halen song. You Really Got Me from Van Halen, which is a Kinks cover. The Kinks, another one of those bands from the 60s that kind of influence a lot of the sounds that we hear in the 70s. Ain't Talking About Love, I'm the One, Jamie's Crying, Atomic Punk, Feel Your Love Tonight, Little Dreamer, Ice Cream Man, and On Fire. That's the tracks for Van Halen's first studio album. And honestly, half of those songs, if not more, are classic Van Halen tunes that you can hear on the radio today, and you can still expect, I think, a majority of people, depending on who you're around, to know those songs and to listen to those songs and enjoy those songs. And I'm a big fan of those songs as well. So we get to Van Halen's second album, Van Halen 2, which kind of following a formula, so to speak, of, another popular 70s band, which we'll get into in a minute. But I haven't listened to Van Halen 2 as much. I know Beautiful Girls and Dance the Night Away. Those are the 2 big songs, the 2 big tracks off of that album. Not as big as the first album, but still some solid stuff in there for sure. So Van Halen, kind of a band that, as opposed to a band like Black Sabbath or some other bands that began and had a whole reign of dominance over the decade, Van Halen kind of gets their spark towards the end of the 70s and carries that into the 80s and beyond. So, I just alluded to an act who I was saying Van Halen, and they had Van Halen 2, kind of like some other band who reigned over the 70s. I'm, of course, talking about Led Zeppelin, whose first 3 albums were Led Zeppelin 1, Led Zeppelin 2, Led Zeppelin 3, nice. But the thing about Zeppelin, and I know I said at the top of the show, I'm only considering 70s bands, those bands who debuted in the 1970s. And Zeppelin didn't technically debut in the 1970s. I believe they formed in 1968, and their first album came out in 1969. Their first 2 albums, in fact, came out in 1969. So their third album, Led Zeppelin 3, which, underrated album, kind of an acoustic folk vibe, but still has some rocking tracks like Immigrant Song. And I claim I'm a Zeppelin fan. I'm so embarrassed. Immigrant Song, Out on the Tiles, and again, then there's that folkier vibe. Celebration Day kind of rocks. I love that album. I want to listen to that album right now. I need to go give it a listen. But yeah, so Zeppelin technically debuts before the 70s, but when we talk about influence on the 70s, their album that comes out in 1971, their best album, Led Zeppelin IV, or Untitled. It's technically has no title, but commonly known as Led Zeppelin IV. It's got the old man with a bundle of sticks on his back, and I believe a cane as well, and a picture frame of that on, a wall. Stairway to Heaven. That's all I'm going to say. That song, one of the greatest songs of all time. I think I'm going to say that. Rock and Roll. Misty Mountain Hop. Black Dog. Need I say more? Like, those songs are so kind of like Van Halen's first album. Led Zeppelin IV is chock full of tracks that you hear on the radio and people still enjoy and people still listen to and people still stream and people still buy this music. It's so impactful, and it came from the 70s, which is the whole theme of this episode, the 70s being an incredibly impactful decade. And, one that, not sure it gets enough. Well, it gets recognition. I'm not going to lie. The 70s are great, and they get their recognition. But Zeppelin albums from the 70s, we got Led Zeppelin IV, 71. Then their fifth album, Houses of the Holy, 73. Sixth album, Physical Graffiti, comes out in 1975. That's a big album. Big as in has a lot of tracks on it. Most notably Cashmere, among others. But Cashmere is the big one that sticks out when you're talking about radio play and ones that people will most likely know. But that album has a lot more than just Cashmere. I'm trying to think here. Custard Pie. That's a rock vibe kind of song. I mean, it's a rock band, so they're all going to be rock songs. Boogie with Stew. They get kind of funky. The Rover, Houses of the Holy. In My Time of Dying, their longest song is incredible, just bluesy. It's all over the place. But I'm not going to turn this into a Physical Graffiti episode. Then we have Presence in 1976 and 1979, Into the Outdoor. And to close out the 70s, in 1980, the fall of 1980, John Bonham tragically passes away. So that kind of ends Zeppelin's time. So Zeppelin, while they didn't start in the 70s, it started a year before, their dominance, if you had to put them, are they a 60s band or a 70s band, you would definitely say 70s. So I'm going to include them as probably one of, if not my favorite band from the 1970s. But I think there would be some competition for favorite band from the 70s. Another one of my favorite bands from the 70s is Kiss. And I know what some of you may be thinking, Kiss, what? This guy is lame. Why does he like Kiss? Kiss gets a lot of hate, I know, because, they're just a stage show. They don't make good music. It's all, explosions and makeup and this and that and the other. I'm going to respectfully disagree with that crowd because they're out there. But Kiss was the first band that I really found an attachment to. Kiss was what I listened to through a lot of my childhood. Kiss debuted in 1974 with their first album, Kiss. Similar to Van Halen's first album and a lot of first albums, it's got a lot of classics on it. It's got a lot of songs that you would hear if you went to a Kiss show. It's a lot of fan favorites from the first Kiss album. Then we go to Hotter Than Hell, Dressed to Kill, and then we get the big one, which will get an episode of its own. And I'm, of course, talking about Kiss Alive. Kiss Alive, which I have on vinyl downstairs, and I have on CD right here. It's what saved Kiss's career, first and foremost, and we'll get into all of this in the Kiss Alive episode, but incredibly impactful. At the time, live albums were kind of risky, but they did it, they pulled it off, and saved their career, catapults them into fame. and success, they come out after Kiss Alive with Destroyer, tracks like Detroit Rock City and Beth, some of their more known music, Rock and Roll Over, Calling Dr. Love, etc., and Love Gun. And that's really the end of the original lineup of Kiss. Not technically, but that's the end of their prime, I would say. And I believe in 1977 there was a poll from a magazine whose name I cannot remember, but Kiss was one of the most popular bands in America at the time. So Kiss, definitely influential, kind of differed from how they started, towards the latter half of the 70s and even beyond. They began to sell a lot of merchandise. Kiss lunchboxes. There was a Kiss comic book, which they printed with their own blood mixed into the ink. Kiss everything. That's really, and that's kind of what Kiss is known for now, and that's kind of what people dunk on Kiss for today, and Gene Simmons in particular, kind of being greedy and kind of just, being in it for the money and just making silly products that, just to get a quick buck. And in fact, one that comes to mind is a Kiss coffin. Like, who would want to be buried in a Kiss coffin? I'm not saying I want to be buried in a Kiss coffin, but I believe Dimebag Darrell of Pantera fame is buried in a Kiss coffin. I cannot confirm that, but I have heard that before. So that's out there. That's out there. Not sure if it's true or not, but Kiss, one of my favorite bands, and of course, that was not all they had to offer from the 70s after Love Gun. 78, they break off and do solo albums. And 79, they do Dynasty, which has their big song, I Was Made for Lovin' You. Interesting thing about Dynasty, which I can connect to another topic here, they were kind of criticized for Dynasty for having a disco sound. Now, disco was a big genre that kind of came up in the 70s out of dance music and stuff like that, and even shifted towards hip-hop and other stuff that we would see into the 80s and 90s. But the show is really focused on rock and metal. Now, while some might consider, disco a portion or a subset of rock or metal, I'm not really going to talk much about disco here today, but I do recognize its contribution to music and its impact and its influence along the line. So, moving on from Kiss, and like Black Sabbath, Kiss of the 70s, the best Kiss. It's their best stuff to offer. So, other great bands from the 70s, this episode could probably be an hour long if I really sat down and thought about it and really wrote this out, but I was sitting down and I was trying to think, who are some great bands who debuted in the 70s? Like, who are someone because the 70s, it's so broad. It's seems like there's so much to pick, but who are the real big ones? And I wrote down, Black Sabbath and then Led Zeppelin. Well, Van Halen started late in the 70s, but I guess I could still talk about them. And there was one that I was like, oh my gosh, this is one of the most popular bands of all time. This is one of the most influential bands of all time. And this is even one of the most listened to bands today. I'm talking about Queen. Yes, Queen. I am a Queen fan. I think most people are Queen fans. I think most people have a Queen song that they hear and they enjoy it. I think it's hard not to like Queen's music. Their sound shifts a lot over time, Their nearly 20-year career stretching from the early 70s to the late 80s. I believe Any Window came out in 91, I believe. So that was their last album. They debuted in 1973. If we're talking just about 70s Queen, they released 8 albums, including a live album. Queen's first album, it's a nice song, nice album. My favorite track off of that is probably Liar. Queen 2, haven't really listened much to Queen 2, if I'm going to be honest. Sheer Heart Attack comes out in 1974, and I think Sheer Heart Attack is probably kind of where they start to catch their stride, so to speak. I think Queen 1 and Queen 2, they're kind of getting comfortable, and Sheer Heart Attack, they start to get a fit. And then we hit A Night at the Opera. This is probably their best album, but I think I have a different album for my favorite, but I think this is widely considered most people's favorite. Bohemian Rhapsody. Need I say more? Kind of like Led Zeppelin's fourth album. It seems like the fourth album, kind of where bands hit it big. Maybe I could do an episode on that where look at bands whose fourth album was their best, or the album where they just had it all clicking. Because I think you could definitely include A Night at the Opera, Bohemian Rhapsody, You're My Best Friend, 39, I'm in Love with My Car. All great songs that come off of A Night at the Opera. We shift to A Day at the Races. Somebody to Love being the big song off of that album, but there's other notable and good songs that come from this. So 1976, A Day at the Races, excuse me, and then 1977's News of the World, which I have downstairs on vinyl. That's probably my favorite Queen album. I'm not sure what it is. I just like the mood, so to speak, and the tone that the album brings. We Are the Champions and We Will Rock You. Those come off that album. So yeah. Other songs that aren't really as recognized, such as like Spread Your Wings, My Melancholy Blues, Who Needs You. Those Sleeping on the Sidewalk, which I believe Brian May sings. Those are fun songs that don't always get the recognition. So that's kind of why I'm drawn to News of the World. And then 1978, we have Jazz, which is the last studio album released by Queen in the 70s. So, Jazz, Fat Bottom Girls, Don't Stop Me Now. Those are probably the biggest songs off of it. And then 1979, they released Live Killers. And then in 1980, they kick off 80s era Queen with The Game. So 70s Queen, it's diverse. It has a lot of different sounds, a lot of different moods, we'll say. But it's very good music. Probably the most recognizable era of Queen. But with the release of the movie, which is now, I believe, been 2 years, maybe, I think it'll be 3 this fall. I was a big fan of that movie. Haven't seen it in a while, so maybe I'll have to pop that into the DVD player. But that definitely spurred a lot of people's interest in Queen, and rightfully so, because there's a lot of good stuff that comes from that band. So, if we take a check at the time here, we're at 27 minutes right now as of recording this. I try to get to about half an hour each episode. And I've got other things, such as schoolwork and whatnot, I got to get to today. So, I'm going to list one last band that I think is one of my favorites from the 1970s. Again, these aren't what I think are the definitive top 5 bands, but these are just kind of my favorites. And again, if you think I missed some, be sure to let me know. Follow the podcast on Owen's Rock and Metal Podcast. Shoot me a DM, comment on a post. However, I'll see it somehow and let me know, hey, you missed this band. You should have talked about this band more. What about this? Where's the love for this band? And, maybe it can open me up to some new artists and some new stuff that I haven't heard before. But the last band that debuted in the 70s that I am a fan of, the almighty, the great, one of the greatest bands of all time, Acdc. They formed in 1973 out of Australia. Their first album, High Voltage, came out in 1976. 6 albums of the 70s, including a live album. It's the Bon Scott era. So if you're an AC/DC fan at all or familiar with the band, they have 2 lead singers, not counting their stint with Axl Rose in the 2000s. That was pretty recently, actually. I believe it was 2018 or 2019. But the Bon Scott era, Brian Johnson era, I'm not going to give who I think is better right now because I'll save that for another episode. But the Bon Scott era consists of 1976 High Voltage, as well as Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, 1977's Let There Be Rock, 1978's Power Age, and 1979 Highway to Hell, the best AC/DC album. Some of you might be, oh, what about Back in Black? Back in Black, Hell's Bells. You Shook Me All Night Long. Those are staples of rock radio. Those are AC/DC's powerful hits. That's AC/DC in a nutshell. Sure, it's all good music. But, come on. Highway to Hell, Girls Got Rhythm, Touch Too Much, Night Prowler. I mean, come on. Like, Highway to Hell is the best AC/DC album. And it comes right at the conclusion of the decade, 1979. 70s AC/DC, I think if you're a real AC/DC fan or if you're really into it, you recognize it. If you're a casual, someone who just likes to hear stuff on rock radio or whatever, or doesn't really, get that deep into bands, you might not recognize as much from this era of AC/DC. It's a different tone. It's definitely a different sound from the vocalist. Bon Scott and Brian Johnson have different styles and different sounds that they use to sing, but they both make good music and they both make rock music. But I said I wouldn't give my answer, but I prefer Bon Scott era a little bit to Brian Johnson. I think it's just more consistent. Now, it's a shorter period of time, but 70s AC/DC, it's really impressive to note how, 1979, they released Highway to Hell, and then they flip right back around with a new singer in 1980, and they release Back in Black, and then they continue their dominance. It's really not something I'm sure a lot of bands could pull off. But High Voltage, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, Let There Be Rock, Power Rage, and Highway to Hell, it's a really blues-influenced, it's a really kind of like bad boy attitude that the band brings. They're just a couple of rough guys from Australia, and they're here to play some loud music for you. So that's kind of the attitude that they bring with the Bon Scott era. So I think it's very good. So 70s AC/DC, kind of like Van Halen, start releasing music in the latter half of the 70s, and catapults them into their 80s success. And similar to Led Zeppelin, in a way, tragically, Bon Scott did pass away in 1980 after the success of Highway to Hell. Who knows what could have been if he would have stayed alive and stuck around. But tragically, that's not how things went. But unlike Led Zeppelin, AC/DC did not call it quits, and they stuck with it, and they found a new singer, and they're still around today. Released a new album back in the fall, Power Up. Gonna be honest, haven't heard much of it. I heard a single off of it, which I liked. So some would say AC/DC's been making the same music for 40 years, and I'm not sure they'd be wrong, but if it ain't broke, don't fix it. All right, well, that's just about going to do it for us here today. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you've enjoyed previous episodes, and I hope you enjoy the show in general. Be sure to, like, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. What am I even saying? This isn't YouTube. Be sure to follow the podcast on Instagram, Owen's Rock and Metal Podcast. That is Owen's Rock and Metal Podcast. You can also follow my personal page, OwenW409, just if you are interested in my life at all. And be sure to follow us on Spotify if you listen to us on Spotify, or follow us on whatever platform you listen to, whether it's Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Overcast, wherever. They're all available at the link in my bio on both of those social media accounts. That's Owen's Rock and Metal Podcast for the podcast account, and OwenW409 for my personal account. So today, this was episode 7. We talked about some of my favorite bands from the decade of the 70s. Thanks for kicking it with me today, and I hope to see you guys back next week. Let me see what we got for the podcast topic next week. This would be episode 8, and I am talking about, this is good. I'm excited about this one. I'm talking about an album by Megadeth, Rust in Peace. Tune in for that if you're a metal fan, if you're a Megadeth fan, or if you're a fan of the podcast. Check it out next week. Rust in Peace. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to sit down with my friend John. We're going to talk it out because we're both into Megadeth, so that's going to be fun. So that's going to do it for us today. Thank you guys for tuning in so much, and as always, never stop rocking.